Hi. So we're here on Blogging Heads, and we're going to be talking about some interesting work that you've been doing recently in preparation for a book. And I guess you've written the book already on the perception of time. So perhaps we'll start off just by introducing ourselves. I'm Jesse Bering. I'm a psychologist, and I write a column for Scientific American called Bering in Mind, and I also write for Slate magazine. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Jessa Gamble, and I write for The Last Word on Nothing, which is a science blog. And I've written a book called The Siesta and the Midnight Sun, which is about the body clock and its effect on culture.
So how did you get into this particular topic as a writer, and what attracted you to this research area?
Well, I started learning about circadian rhythms, or the body clock, in university, and I worked in a lab with rats and sort of looking at their running wheel activity and seeing how it follows a 24-hour cycle, even if the day and night are not obvious to the rat, even if it's a constant lighting conditions. So that really fascinated me, and it continues to fascinate me. But what really got me working on this latest project is the realization that this is a hidden force in our culture and on all the cultures around the world, and that it may be changing right now with globalization.
That's related to, I guess, the first question that I had for you is, what are there any sort of human specializations when it comes to time perception or circadian rhythms? What makes human time regulation different from other species, if anything?
Well, there's always the debate of, how much consciousness other animals have and whether it's of degree or of kind, but certainly our level of free will and conscious access to our own behaviors makes things different, because our sleep-wake cycles are a conscious choice. We can decide to stay up even though our body is telling us we should sleep, and we do a lot of that. And we can decide to go to another country where the time zone is different and completely mess with our cycles, and we do a lot of that now too. So there's a lot of artificial influences now. We do a lot of drugs that either put us to sleep or keep us awake, and there are some new generation. There's a new generation of pharmaceuticals that's even exacerbating that. And so, just basically, technology is completely changing.
I'm wondering if there are, from an evolutionary perspective, because that's oftentimes how I sort of characterize things, sort of in a meta-theoretical framework. What changes have we seen, over the past 100,000 years? I mean, if you were to, do we know anything from the paleoarchaeological records about sleep patterns in ancient humans? Or maybe making inferences on the basis of chimpanzee sleep patterns and so on?
Well, behavior doesn't fossilize well, so what we can do is look at our relatives and also at traditional societies now to have some clues as to our ancestral sleeping patterns. But the innovation that we've made in the past, in fairly recent evolutionary history, but still, way back in our history, was the advent of fire, and of course that's artificial light, and that triggers our circadian systems to think that it might still be daylight. And that was the beginning of colonizing the night, as I call it in my book, where you basically start eking into the darkness hours and claiming them for our daytime.
Sort of artificial lighting.
Exactly.
Now, before we get into, lots of your book, I'm assuming it deals with the relatively dramatic differences from a cross-cultural perspective. Is there anything that is universal in either sleep patterns or our perception of time passing, or this sort of circadian rhythms and regulatory cycles, things that we all have in common as human beings, as a species?
Yes, and in fact, we share it with every known being that has two or more cells, and some that only have one cell. It's actually just a facet of life on a rotating planet, and so anywhere that you're going to have light and darkness as a cycle, the life is going to adapt ways to anticipate that in order to maximize the benefits that the UV light can give, and that the darkness can give in terms of shelter. And basically, we as a species have a universal system that doesn't really vary much. We differ a little bit from each other in terms of chronotype. Some of us are morning owls, morning larks, and some of us are night owls. But in general, we all have this 24-hour internal cycle. So the cultural adaptations that are so different are all overlaid on the same biological system, or at least for the purposes of my book.
There are certainly species that do capitalize on the night, and that are, from a biological perspective, would be conceptualized as nocturnal. So what differs from from an adaptationist perspective? How did those species come about?
Well, we all have our own niches, and some of those are physical, geographical niches. Some of them are sort of food-type niches, but there are also temporal niches that species fit into. And so the nocturnal species fit into a nighttime niche, but their actual circadian systems look very similar biologically. It's just that their melatonin kicks in the daytime instead of at night, and so they go to sleep in the day. But in terms of the mammalian system that we have, it's centered in a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is just a little bundle of nerve cells that are above where the optic nerves meet. And that came about early in mammalian history when mammals were nocturnal. So that's kind of an interesting sort of evolutionary bottleneck that we went through and came out of with this different system from what reptiles or birds have.
Okay. And I'm just wondering how the melatonin production works, and the relationship between solar radiation and sun, basically, and melatonin production, and what the nature of melatonin production is for species that wouldn't be dependent upon the sun.
Well, most species, one way or another, get information from the sun that reflects or that resets their circadian system. It calibrates the rhythm. So otherwise, you tend to drift around the clock, sort of free running on these roughly 24-hour cycles, but not exactly 24 hours. So every morning at dawn, for example, when light hits our eyes from the sun, we recalibrate our system. We reset our clocks. So how it exactly works, we actually have receptors dedicated in our eyes, on our retinas. You know about rods and cones, which is the most famous sort of photoreceptors, but recently discovered by Robert Foster and his colleagues at Oxford, are these melanopsin receptors, which actually gauge general levels of brightness. And there's a specific pathway that takes that goes into the master clock in the brain and tells it that, okay, there's light outside, it's daytime, time to reset the clock, and by the way, shut off the melatonin because we need to be getting up.
So from independent, I guess, of cultural differences, are there biological differences in different geographically demarcated human populations? I guess I'm thinking about eumelanin production and sort of different skin colors, and how that might influence sleep-wake cycles. For example, somebody from Eastern Europe moving to equatorial Africa.
So there's not much of that, and I don't think that. So melanopsin very different from melanin. Basically, I haven't come across any systematic population differences. If there are population differences, I assume that it's just from genetic drift and things like that. I don't think that because it's such a universal system. It's in bacteria and insects and everything else. I mean, it just and it's an area that I didn't particularly try to find those population differences, because what I'm interested in is the cultural aspect of it. Also, I should mention that, the intersection between biology and culture has kind of a shady history, and so that's another reason why I didn't want to look for those differences. And there's not really much research into it either.
Do you mean from sort of a controversial perspective that?
Sorry, what's that?
What do you mean by sort of a shady history? Do you mean just looking at biological differences from a controversial perspective and skin color, or something else?
Right. I wasn't interested in finding out that, certain populations biologically need to sleep more or something, and there's nothing to suggest that they do. And so basically what I looked at was how humans adapt to the place that they're at and the light conditions that happen there. And for example, where we evolved as a species, there were 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night roughly all the time. It wasn't all that seasonal, other than sort of rainy season and dry season. But
yeah,
now
we've spread to the whole globe. The reason I ask is because I remember coming across something, and I can't remember exactly where I saw this, but some empirical evidence suggesting that different ethnicities are differentially affected by seasonal affective disorder.
Okay.
And it was, I think there was some argument that it was somehow traced to melatonin production. And
okay.
vitamin D absorption.
I haven't heard ethnicity being implicated in that. Certainly latitude, as populations at different latitudes differentially experience it. And so, but this is all linked into culture as well, because even if you found that where I am, the Inuit population didn't experience seasonal affective disorder, but the immigrants from the south did. In the winter, they got depressed, and in the summer, they became manic. It still wouldn't tell you that that was based in ethnicity, because there's a strong cultural adaptation to the latitude up here, and they've learned how to deal with things. They've got their whole schedule mapped up, and they know exactly what to expect in the season. And so it's very hard to untangle those different threads.
Right. I understand. So from a very simple question, perhaps backtracking a little bit, would be, what is the sort of commonsensical assumptions about sleep, the need for sleep, and the number of hours per sleep in Canada and the U.S. and so on, and how that actually translates to our statistically to our sleep-related behaviors?
Well, we have this notion that 8 hours of continuous sleep is what we need, and that's sufficient biological. I mean, that's fine, but it's not the only way to sleep. It's not typical in a lot of societies where you sort of have this segmented sleep. You wake up in the middle of the night and sort of go socialize around the fire, and then you sort of go back to bed whenever the conversation isn't interesting, and people are all sleeping in the same area with each other, not on these sort of raised platforms with absolute quiet.
And from a westernized perspective, when we think about children, going to sleep at a certain hour and sleeping, and I guess the ideal is that they sleep through the night. So from a very early age, we are socialized into these, I guess you would call them, cultural expectations about sleep-wake patterns, the sort of continuous.
That's an issue that's like dear to me right now because I have a 2-year-old and it's just been, 2 years of, finally getting this schedule into order. And it's very much, an adult kind of Western schedule type demand on them to
Right.
just like, to sleep through the night when they normally would be getting up periodically. But
And it would be literally,
yeah,
it would be impossible to sort of rebel against that cultural institution of an 8-hour block of sleep. By maybe having a different pattern for your child if you're living in a society where that's not the norm, because obviously
unless you
everything else.
Unless you don't have a need to have a 9 to 5 work schedule and be in sync with the rest of global society. In that case, you can, and there are a lot, some attachment parenting calls for just sort of being on call at all hours, but you really have to fit a lot of other aspects of your life around that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it would be difficult, in other words. So tell me a little bit about, maybe some of the more, you started mentioning this earlier, but some of the more striking cultural differences that you've come across in writing the book.
I came across fewer cultural differences than I hoped to, and I think the reason for that is that we've spread our cultural influence so far around the world, along with our other kind of cultural exports, and we're losing this circadian diversity. We're losing the specificity to the location that all these timetables are built around. But I certainly in Japan, there's this sort of 24-hour culture that really epitomizes sort of the extreme of what we've started in North America. And that's interesting to see because you have people kind of making up for a week's worth of sleep deprivation on a Sunday, and that doesn't biologically really work out, but they're trying a lot of different experiments. People actually are getting into polyphasic sleep, which is this strange schedule where you kind of stay up for 2 hours and then sleep for 20 minutes or something. And a lot of people are blogging on their internet their experience of it. There's this obsession with productivity that we're trying to accommodate, even though a third of our life is stolen by sleep. So there are various ways that people are trying to get around it. And I mean, I admire their resistance to this biological imperative. But if you follow their diaries of trying not to sleep so much, you find they're gradually sort of mental deterioration. They're just blogging that they're, just fighting sleep at all times. They're totally mentally incapacitated.
It's almost like we have a love-hate relationship with sleep. On the one hand, it feels so good, and we crave it. But on the other hand, it's anathema because, to me, there's nothing worse than fatigue in the middle of the day.
Yes.
Yes. And that's why I'm addicted. That's why I'm addicted to caffeine, I think. But yeah, I can certainly appreciate trying to maximize wakefulness, the amount of time that we actually can be productive during the day.
Well, you say that it feels so good, but you're unconscious when you're sleeping. So what is it that feels good? Is it the absence of fatigue afterwards? Is it the losing of consciousness? I really do think that when people say they enjoy sleeping, I'm not sure exactly what they mean most of the time because there's very little of sleep that you really experience. Maybe, dreaming and so on.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right.
That's an interesting question. That's an interesting. For me,
attitude.
I guess epiphenomenally, it feels good because it's, maybe it's sort of the absence of consciousness. You're sort of lapsing into a psychological state where you're not thinking, and thinking itself is effortful and it's exhaustive. So it's a reprieve from consciousness to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have the value system that's around sleep is contradictory, and we have this sort of mixed feeling of you know, you have to get a good night's rest because it refreshes you to be more productive, but sleeping is kind of a lazy thing to do at the same time. It's healthful, and
Yes.
yet there's this virtue to getting up early and, you know, increasing your waking hours in the morning. But if you stay up late, that's kind of being a bit of a libertine, and because it's associated with social activity or leisure activity versus the morning. So it's interesting how we have these associations. Even the religious texts are kind of mixed on whether God
Yeah.
sleeps, for example, or the histories of really famous people and really amazing thinkers are, the same names always come up, but, Einstein and Da Vinci and Salvador Dali apparently, slept. He would balance a spoon on his hand and then sleep until it fell, kind of thing. There's all these urban legends that arise, and the more famous a person is, like the less they have to sleep, apparently. Which is, I
Mm.
think, reflects something that is deep inside of our motivation system, where we really resent that imperative.
And I don't know about other people, but I feel guilty taking naps in the middle of the day. I mean, to me, it's almost like a moral transgression
Absolutely.
to somehow, to somehow. I mean, because like you said, I mean, it's this sort of connotation of being lazy, and we should be doing something more productive, uh, whether it's for society as a whole or just as reflecting something about our own individual ambitions. I don't know, but I think that is deeply embedded in our culture to feel irresponsible or to feel guilty by sleeping during the middle of the day. And I know that you talked a little bit about the phenomenon of siestas in Spain and the fact that may be changing.
Yeah, so the siesta is something that, by some accounts, it only really arose in the Civil War, when there was such a labor shortage that people had to keep multiple jobs. And so they would go to a job until 3 in the afternoon, go home, take a short nap, and then go straight back to work until late in the evening. But they've sort of maintained this schedule whenever it came about, where they work really late, but they have this long lunch hour. But then as Barcelona, Madrid, and the other bigger cities started to grow, you work not so close to your home, and so it's not practicable anymore to go all the way home, do a reverse commute just to eat and sleep, and then come back to work. So it's being phased out. That's not the only reason, actually. It's also kind of the demands of global business, so joining the EU and so on. So if someone in France wants to have a conference call with your branch of your company at 4 in the afternoon, and you're told, well, that's actually our siesta, that it has these implications, again, with the moral connotations of taking time off to replenish yourself. No one wants to be thought of as lazy, and of course it's not the case there, because they're working until 10, 11 at night, but still they've phased it out to be more in sync with the rest of Europe. And it only really is being maintained in the smaller towns. There's actually there's a
Right.
siesta competition that they've started to try to revive the practice. But overall, you're seeing that die out in the service of globalization.
I wonder if there's also something about because when you're sleepy during the day, it's almost symptomatic of, and oftentimes it really is symptomatic of some health problems. So there could be some sort of a stigmatizing effect of exhibiting fatigue during the day because you're not healthy, and people have this aversion to suggesting to others that somehow they're less fit.
That's
I
right.
mean, there obviously
It's
there
a
are. I mean, there are health. There are legitimate ailments where it does manifest in fatigue.
Yes, it suggests a lack of vigor, and it's also, a symptom of depression and so on. So it's not seen as healthful unless it's in nighttime. And one of the
Right.
first symptoms of many illnesses across the board is sleep disruption. People find that they're not sleeping as well. They don't know exactly why. They're not sleeping as deeply. And then it turns out later that it was one of the first signs of something systemically wrong.
Right. So you talked about chronotypes, which are individual differences in sleep patterns,
Yes.
or sort of the natural fit of different sleep cycles for different individuals. How many? I mean, is there actually a classification system,
No, it's
or
a
is it just?
spectrum. So
Sorry, go
basically,
ahead.
so most of us are what's been called hummingbirds, which is sort of somewhere in between a morning lark and a night hawk. Women are, about half of them fall into the kind of morning people category, whereas men, about a third of them do. So there's that sex difference there. There is some biological basis for those differences. So there's a suggestion that if your body clock actually takes, say, 25 hours to complete its cycle, a little bit longer than normal, then you would tend toward being an evening person because you're always just trying to slip a little bit later into the night because your cycle is a little longer, whereas morning people would have shorter cycles. But there's also a lot of social pressures. So depending on your work and your social schedule, you might basically be forced to be a morning lark in the weekdays, and then you have this kind of social jet lag where
Right.
you have to become an evening person in the weekend.
Um, I wonder. I mean, do we know anything about the developmental mechanisms in chronotype formation? Um, can we trace anything back to sort of early childhood napping patterns or family, interfamily differences in when children go to bed and those types of things?
I haven't found anything to
It'd
suggest
be
that.
hard.
I found a little bit that supports a genetic basis or a heritability of these things, but I haven't found any environmental influences that would encourage someone to naturally tend toward morning or evening. Certainly, environmental influences will change when you go to bed, but not how eager you are to
So I'm
go to
wondering.
bed.
I guess I'm wondering if there are some. I'm wondering if there's some sort of entraining process of circadian rhythms in early childhood, whether there's a sort of sensitive period where we learn what's expected of us, over a successive period of several early years, early in development.
That's a great question, and as far as I know, it hasn't been answered. So it's really an embryonic field. It only started, the circadian rhythms field really kind of launched in maybe 1960. There's a big conference that kind of brought together a lot of authorities at that time, and so the interdisciplinary link that I'm talking about in my book between circadian rhythms and culture really hasn't been made so much in the literature. And part of the reason that I wrote the book was to suggest that research be done because it's such an exciting and
Right.
potentially fruitful area.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I'm interested in why, for example, um, why we have children take naps, and why we stop doing that at a certain age. Is it
Oh,
just,
yeah.
are these, where did these ideas come from? Is it just something that has permeated our sort of popular common sense, or are there actual studies supporting the benefits of having children take naps in kindergarten, for example, or preschool,
Right.
and then stopping
Uh,
at later ages?
I mean, up to a certain point, it's not really, you either schedule their naps or they just sort of pass out on you. So
Yeah.
it has to be a biological thing that they really can't stay conscious for all that long. And then you really notice them becoming tired, right? They start getting cranky. But whether that's because they're used to that
Yeah.
rhythm and then their bodies start telling them that it's bedtime because they're used to that nap. Again, it's a very hard thing to untangle all those confounds.
So that idea of children getting cranky, does that translate to adult mood regulation as well? For sort
That's
of
a good question.
deficits in sleep. I mean, I get moody.
Irritability, yeah,
it's
for
a
sure. I
general
mean,
temperament,
sleep
but I do think I
deprivation.
get a little cranky.
Yeah, for sure that's one. And I mean, any sort of bodily discomfort is going to lead to some irritability in your mood. But certainly there's a lot of mood correlations. There's a strange effect that they find that with depression, if you even with people who are resistant to medication or don't experience good effects from medication, if you kind of keep them up for a night, there's this very short-lived effect of antidepressant. And so they're looking at all the neurotransmitters that are involved in sleep and trying to figure out why exactly that is, whether it's the serotonin, is it used up by the sleep or what is it?
Hmm. I'm actually quite interested in this topic because I spent 5 years in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which is quite north in latitude, and it was dark. It got dark in the winters at 3 in the afternoon, and in the summers the sun wouldn't set until midnight. And coming from spending the previous 5 years in South Florida, that was a very dramatic shock to my circadian rhythm. And I definitely felt, I didn't know much about seasonal affective disorder before moving there, but I definitely experienced the phenomenon, and it seems to me, patently real. But you talk about something related to seasonal affective disorder that's not as well known, I guess. You call it summer mania.
Right. It's the correlate that either doesn't get reported as much because it's not, full-blown mania, perhaps in the way that seasonal affective disorder is not full-blown depression in most cases. And so people are just unusually energetic, optimistic, confident, impulsive during the summertime because they're getting so much sunlight that, it never seems like it's time to sleep. And they sleep very little in the summer. And, it makes sense in the sense that bipolar patients often have a seasonal trigger to their depression and mania. So it may be a kind of a smaller microcosm of that, where it's someone who's certainly not got any sort of disorder unless they're put in this environment that really encourages shutting down, for sort of semi-hibernating in winter, and then really getting all your work done in summer.
I definitely noticed. I definitely noticed living in Belfast that when the spring hit, I mean, people really did just kind of come out of the woodwork, and everybody's mood was enhanced, and I mean, it definitely seemed like a real phenomenon. It wasn't just something that we were imagining. People were
No. I mean, there's this huge rush. Like where I am, it's you get very few hours of daylight in the winter, and then right now, like we've already overtaken you guys, and we've got sunlight right up until midnight essentially. And when that first spring day comes along, and it's warm enough to go outside after 5 months of -40, it's this huge rush. I mean, it's just, there's no mistaking it that it's this biochemical high that you're getting that feels like drugs. It's really quite a spectacular kind of demonstration of seasonality in our body clock.
So I guess there are two separable elements here, though. That there's solar radiation, which is just sort of the presence of sunlight, but then there's also climate.
Yes.
And temperature regulation, and those things are obviously entwined. but do they operate independently, or are they in terms of these mood enhancing effects, for example? Because typically with seasonal affective disorder, it's not only dark, but it's also very cold.
Exactly. So it is very hard to separate those two, and I think they must interact and compound each other. Because when it's really cold, you can't get your exercise very comfortably, even when it is light outside. You're less likely to see that light that does exist, and so your body clock gets out of sync. You no longer feel like it's time to get up when it's 7 or 8 in the morning, and there's no separating the two because latitude and climate also vary because the two are slightly entwined, and so it's. You're right. Those two factors are inseparable unless you put them under laboratory conditions, which has been done, and I'm sure that both of them are strong factors.
I'm just wondering about, if you look at maybe the presence of seasonal affective disorder someplace in where it's quite sunny, but it's still cold in the winters. I don't know, someplace like California, Northern California, or Colorado, or something like that. Do we see
I
the
see what you
same
mean, like in a
effects?
kind of a mountainous climate or something.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. It is hard to experiment here in that, or to draw meaningful correlations, because whenever we're inside, which is almost all of the time, it's kind of a spring day, mid-afternoon kind of.
Except if you live in my
mimics-
house, where my partner doesn't let me turn on the lights to save electricity during the day. But yeah, I get your point.
That's crazy.
Speaking of
really?
relationships, yeah, pretty much.
Yes.
Speaking of relationships, I was actually thinking about how people of different chronotypes and their compatibility in that regard
yes.
can affect.
That's something that totally
marriages
fascinates me.
Yeah.
And there's actually been work been done on that as well, because if you have one partner who's an evening person, another person who's a morning type, and they get together, and there's actually a whole politics that goes on, negotiating the bedtime, negotiating sleeping conditions. Are you going to have the window open or closed? Who's stealing the covers? Does somebody snore? And it's a huge strain on relationships if those things aren't all worked out.
So you want to be compatible on chronotypes, ideally.
Ideally, I think yes, you should be in sync, because otherwise you only see each other in between.
Interesting. And I've got to ask this too, because
it's not something
I write
that
quite a
people
bit about
think to ask on the first date.
Yeah, I write quite a bit about human sexuality, so I'm wondering if you talk about that at all in the book, in terms of sexual behavior and its relationship to circadian rhythms and so on.
A little bit, and so it's kind of famously the male sexual arousal peaks in the early morning, which is not when we have the most sex as a population, which it tends to be 10 or 11 at night, is the peak in the behavior. And so that's one of those situations where social schedules and just, the demands of the day actually conflict with biology.
So do you mean by sexual arousal? I just wrote this article in Scientific American about multiple things, but one of them was nocturnal penile tumescence, which we call morning wood, I think in common language. And whether that's an actual state of sexual arousal, or it's a physiological remnant of REM sleep, and it serves some other purposes. One of the big questions is whether nocturnal penile tumescence actually has any sort of adaptive significance or adaptive function.
Right.
Unfortunately, there hasn't been too much research on that. There's been lots of work on male sexual arousal during the night from a clinical perspective, and using using it as an index of penile dysfunction or erectile dysfunction. But to me, yeah, the adaptation questions are always very interesting.
Well, you were mentioning before we started this interview, you were mentioning something about an article that you'd recently written about nocturnal sex. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. It's a slightly different topic than what we've been talking about, but that piece was about sexsomnia, this phenomenon of people actually acting out sexually during non-REM sleep. So this sleep-related dissociated state where they actually engage in sometimes fairly complex sexual behaviors while they're snoring, while they're asleep. Oftentimes this gets them into legal troubles because they happen to be sleeping with a stranger or somebody that they don't know terribly well, and all of a sudden they're manipulating that person's genitals or something, and so the person screams and wakes up, and they're confused about what they've just done. They have amnesia. They don't know what happened. So it's not entirely clear all the time whether it's just sort of a convenient alibi or they genuinely were sleepwalking when this incident occurred. It had these really interesting, for me, from a psychological perspective, these interesting moral implications in how we attribute responsibility to people and the relationship between sexual arousal and free will.
Yeah, and there's also a period in the morning, about half an hour after waking, where you're not really cognitively with it, and you fare worse on cognitive tests than you would if you were legally drunk, for instance. And so there's also some question of accountability there, because are you sort of, if not insane, are you mentally incompetent at that time of day if someone kind of gives you a life-changing decision to make sort of when you've first woken up?
Like an impaired state early in the morning. Yeah. That's something that I oftentimes experience. I do notice that, in terms of like cognitive functioning, I remember asking Steven Pinker, who is, one of my idols, my intellectual idols at the time, visiting with him and asking him when he peaked intellectually and when he got most of his work done, his writing done. And he told me that it was close to midnight. Which I found quite interesting because for me, I'm pretty much non-functional after about 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the evening. I peak probably around 10 or 11 in the morning. So I found that really interesting.
That's exactly the same for me. Yeah. So, are you a morning person in general? Like, would you say?
I'm definitely a morning person in general, although it's difficult to know anymore because I'm so dependent on caffeine. I don't drink coffee, but I drink these little shots of, which is not good, and I'm loath to admit this, but I drink those, I drink Red Bull, I drink 5-hour energy shots, because I really do, I like the hit, I like that sort of caffeine rush. And again, I mentioned earlier that there's nothing more aversive to me, there's nothing more than anathema than fatigue. When I know that I should be working and I want to work, and yet it's difficult to do that. Actually, it's ironic that we're having this conversation today because I didn't sleep very well last night at all. Until 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a dog outside barking its head off. So I don't feel 100% right now, 100% lucid. And that's really irritating to me.
Yeah, Red Bull and everything that came out of rave culture, it's kind of been integrated into mainstream society now. And I think that sort of those energy drugs have really permeated into the business system as well. You see a lot of cocaine use on Wall Street and things like that.
Yeah. So, what are your feelings about those sort of artificial stimulants?
My feelings about them.
Smart drugs.
Well, I'm fascinated. As a science writer, I'm fascinated by anything that people do to change their own physiology in the service of their own goals. And so I'm fascinated by the way that we have taken this circadian system that we have and either worked with it to accommodate it through culture or worked to resist it. You see long distance solo sailors kind of taking 20-minute naps every few hours just to try to keep the boat on course, but try to get a little bit of rest and not start hallucinating or whatever else. And so I'm fascinated by the extremes, which include these drugs, which, I mean, stimulants are extremely dangerous. And so obviously they're not the way to go. But I'm interested in the fact that people do them and why they do them.
So with, excluding drugs like cocaine, there are these fairly innovative technological pharmaceuticals that are used by Air Force pilots, for example. I can't remember exactly what they're called. Do you know the name of these drugs that they allegedly allow people to go 3 or 4 days without sleep and without actually getting tired?
Yeah, Eurogenics. So they basically are coming to the point where, even though we don't fully understand the purpose of sleep and the mechanisms behind it, because, it has to be an adaptive thing or else we wouldn't be doing such an evolutionarily non-productive thing for a third of our time. So there have to be some strong suggestions that it's an adaptive thing, but basically it looks like we're coming to a point where we may be able to drastically reduce the need for sleep in the future. And there's been some science fiction around this. Nancy Kress wrote an excellent a series of books that were based around the sleepless society and what might happen if a group of people no longer needed to sleep for one reason or another. And that fascinates me. If that's possible, could we get that for free? It seems too good to be true. Like, there's got to be those side effects that always happen in the movies, like in Limitless or whatever. Like, there's this sort of dystopian.
It seems, to me, it seems that one consequence of a sleepless society is that the population would surge because people are obviously going to be awake when they would have otherwise been asleep, and they're going to be having sex more. So that would be a problem, I would imagine, in the long run.
Okay. Well, those two are separable things, right? In this day and age, I don't know. Maybe you could tell me because you've been writing a lot about it, but do societies that have a lot of sex also have the most babies?
It depends on numerous factors in terms of contraceptive availability and so on, but
yes.
But it couldn't help population management, I would imagine. Anyway, but those are the sort of hypothetical questions I agree are incredibly interesting and remain speculative now, but at some point, you're right, it could become a reality.
So I wonder whether we should wrap it up at this point.
Yeah, I think this has been fascinating. Definitely interesting work. And the name of your book again?
The Siesta in the Midnight Sun.
And is it out yet, or what's the publication
It's actually
status?
out in October, but it's available for pre-order now, in Canada at least, or from Canada, I should say. So you can order it in the States. Still looking for an American publisher.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Jess. I appreciate the conversation, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay, take